All right, I want to welcome everybody back to my shop. It's a nice, warm and muggy June day here in Oklahoma, and I think today I'm going to work on the 69 Camaro that's behind me. Before I get too carried away, I want to do a walk around on this car, since this will be the first filmed video that I've done for the channel on this car. I'll catch everybody up to speed and kind of show the work that's been done to this point. I'll flash by some pictures of some of the stuff that was wrong with this car when it came in. And anyway, do me a favor, give me that old thumbs up, and let's go on a journey and I'll show you around this thing. All right, well, we may as well start up here in the front, and you can see that it does have a RideTech a RideTech coilover front suspension. One thing that I typically do, if you'll see on these factory subframes, whenever I'm going to reuse them, I tend to get a little carried away and I will get rid of the 1969 welds on these frames and lace in some new welds before I have this thing powder coated. Try to back up here a little bit. Of course, this got a new core support. This car has had quite a bit of metal work done to it. As you can see, it is going to be, this car will have an LS3 with a 4L80 transmission. But as far as metal work on this car, I've had to replace the dash cap, and I'll show the picture across here. But this section up here on the original car, or the car when I got it here, it was pretty much full of Bondo and foam. And I've replaced the upper dash cap and also the upper and lower cowl. This also has the firewall assembly. The entire firewall assembly has been cut out and replaced. I've done all that work prior. Some of the stuff on the firewall, I got rid of the pucker that's in that right behind the engine area. It's smoothed out. The floor pans have been replaced on this car. The driver's side rocker, of course, both rear quarter panels have been replaced. Inner and outer wheel housings. This car does have Detroit mini tub. I installed those. The frame rails were replaced. Let's see what else. Going back here to the rear, the taillight panel, inner and outer valance, the sail panel. That pretty much has all been replaced on this car. The trunk pan, full trunk pan. And once again, driver's passenger side quarter panel. Also on the inside, the inner quarter panel on the driver's side, I had to replace that lower section of the panel. You can see the floors are all replaced. Also, new seat pans were installed. This car, I do have one of the fenders chucked up, but they had some large wheels on this thing at one time, and whoever owned it, and they trimmed these fenders back. So I've got lower panels for these original fenders. The fenders were in pretty good shape. They weren't rotted out, other than where they cut that. Pretty good shape. You can also see we're going to be going with Willwood brakes. The RideTech suspension's in the back, the cradle's in the back. I'll kind of show that here in just a minute. But the doors weren't bad. I decided to go ahead and put door skins on them. And the structure, if I had this to do over again, I probably would just replace the doors and dealt with fixing them. There's some structure you can see when I put my hand behind it. I've got to do some repair on this corner. The other door, kind of the same thing, not as bad. I think this is the worst one. And much like everything today, parts have been an issue. But I think today I'll either work on the doors. I need to finish building out the front suspension, put the brakes on, get everything fit up. I really need to get the doors on it. But in the back here, I'm to the point I did get the wheels. Like I said, this does have a RideTech suspension. It's 4-linked. I've got everything kind of tacked up. The Holley, no, those are RideTech, sorry. Those are RideTech subframe connectors. I've got transmission cross member. I've got the headers mocked up in here. It's getting close. But today also, this weekend or whenever I so choose. I've got the rear tires and wheel combination. So now I can cut the rear end down and get this stuff all mocked up back here. So that's kind of my plan. Just kind of a do a walk, wanted to do a walk around on the car. I've got some welding to finish up there where the quarters meet the roof and then fill some spots in there. But for the most part, the bulk of the metal work has been done. And now it's just, I want to set up on the car and do some laser. I've got a laser line that I can laser this thing down the center of it to where I make sure everything's straight, which it's been a while since I've worked on this car. So I think I want to go back and double check everything. So that's going to be the next thing I do. So, all right, I'll set up and we'll see what we can get done today. Okay, as you can see, I've got set up and I took a plumb bob off the frame rail, off the subframe on both sides, dropped it down, put me some marks on the tape, and then I centered that. And as you can see, the laser there, I've got a center line mark there. The center line is also shooting all the way to the back. I did the exact same thing back here on the rear where I took the plumb bob off the lip of the quarter panels. Now, you have to take it for what it's worth. The quarters have been replaced. Stuff may not be 100% accurate, but I was able to plumb bob off those quarter panels and the faces of the axle flange to get some marks on the ground. You can see there. And then, just laid the tape measure on the ground. I was able to get the center. I actually got, let's turn it around here. So I got center of the car and center of the axle, and you can see they are extremely close. In fact, they're so close that I don't know that I'm gonna mess with it. But now that I've got that, and I'm shooting the laser up here as well, which is nice. This thing is really cool because it'll shoot a vertical line and a horizontal, and I'm blocking it. But anyway, so as you can see, the center line of the rear end is dead on. Now the offset here, that's the center of the pinion, which the center of the pinion I know lines up with the tunnel. I've kind of already done that. So, and if we look back this direction, we'll kind of see I've got the center line marked on the trans. So everything is centered up in the car. I feel comfortable there. So my plan, I want to move these brackets in just a little bit. I've got plenty of angle on this bracket here, and I want to move this in just a little bit on both sides to where I got a little bit more room for the lip of the rear end, or excuse me, for the lip of the wheels. And now that I've verified everything's straight, I'll be able to go to both sides of the rear end and put me some tubing in here and tack this in to kind of hold this rear end in place. And then I'll cut these tacks loose and move them over accordingly. So that will be what I end up doing next. So, okay, I've managed to get these things tacks cut and moved in accordingly. I still have pretty decent degree, 4 to 5 degrees on the lower bars. So those are tacked in. I think for the most part, I'm pretty comfortable. I think now I'm gonna start getting the rear end cut down. So tomorrow I'll probably chuck up, put the axle in here and do some measuring and see exactly how much I need to take. I do have new bearing. I do have new cups, and that's my plan, is to just take those off, cut the axle, and I've got the jig. I think it's a Mittler's Brother jig to narrow this down with. So at least it's in here and it's squared. The bars are squared, brackets are squared. So I'm pretty pleased with that. Okay. So after taking straight edges, I stuck an axle in this housing and straight edged up to the wheel housing and got a pretty good idea how far I need to cut this thing down, which is anywhere between 3 and 3.5 inches on each side. So what I ended up doing, I took one of the old Ford axles and drilled it to accept a couple of lug nuts so I could bolt the wheel up, entire combo up here, and then verify where I'm at and how far I can cut down. So not a very good angle. But anyway, the next step is I'm gonna verify this, and I may go ahead and pull this one axle out and stuff it into the other. I don't have a center section, so at the end of the day, it's just a matter of where the bearing cups hit, where the bearings are in the axle per side. So I can verify and make sure, but I'm pretty sure I'm gonna be somewhere between 3 and 3.5 inches cut down on it. And I think what I'll end up doing is once I verify my measurements, I might go ahead and bolt up the brakes and then go ahead and pre-fit everything again. But more than likely, I'm getting ready to pull the axle and verify the links on both sides, and then I'll probably just cut it down and get everything tacked up. Once it's tacked up, then I'll put the rear end back in. So I'll try to set up the camera as I start cutting this rear end down. We'll see you in a bit. Well, I had to do just a little bit of rework. For some reason, my measurements were off side to side, and I wasn't quite sure what was going on. And evidently, whenever I tacked these brackets in for these upper links, it pulled my rear end about 3/8 of an inch to the driver's side, or excuse me, the passenger side. And so now I had to cut those loose, and I've got everything lined up off the rear quarter panels. It's very close whenever I measure my distances between the inner fender well and the lip of the quarter. They are within a 30 seconds of each other being true. So I'm gonna go off of that as a center line. I rechecked the center line on the car, and it seems to be in good shape. So I guess whenever I welded those, it pulled that. So what I ended up doing is I've got these tubes tacked in here, and that's about what I want for a ride height on this rear end, and verified my measurements and everything looks good. So now I'll reset. I got my pinion angle set. Can't see the gauge from here, but it's set at about 4 degrees, between 4 and 5 degrees. I'll now go in and redo these upper brackets, tack them into the rear end. Then I'm gonna verify my measurements one more time, and it's actually closer to 4-inch cut down on each of these axle tubes. So I'll get this thing tacked up and welded, and then I'll pull this rear end out after I verify my measurements, and we'll start cutting on the rear. Okay, I got the rear end. Well, first I verified my measurements, and I'm gonna go with about 4 inches on each side of this axle. So I got this thing on some stands, and what I've done is I want 4 inches from the face of this back. So I put me a line at 4 inches, and then these two marks here are basically just some reference marks that I've put in here. But this will be my takeoff for the new bearing ends. So I'll plan on using these two reference marks to make a nice straight one. These I used a pipe fitter's what's called a wraparound to get these good and straight, and I've done it both ends, put me some reference marks, and then this represents the 4-inch mark back from face to that mark. And then of course I went ahead, my takeoff for the new flange is 1.25 inches, so I've put me an 1.25 inch mark back off the face. That'll be the takeoff for the new flange. So I'm gonna make these cuts. I got my new bearing ends in yesterday, and I went ahead and behind me, I've got the axle cut down as far as my initial 4 inches, and then my takeoff from the end of this bevel to the face of this flange was another 1.5 inches. So those 2 reference marks that I put on there, that's where those kind of came into play. I was able to get that mark back, and then once I was used my wraparound to get this new line marked, just kind of measuring around the axle off those references to make sure it's straight. Because this wraparound really is designed to where you can put it all the way on the piece of pipe, and then this axle tube was short, so once I was able to get that kind of worked into the spot where I needed to cut it, then just references off those lines. That's what I use those reference lines for. So now I've got my new bearing ends. I went ahead and I'll see if I can tilt this down, but I've got my carrier, my third member, and the axle cut down kit that I have. Like I said, I believe it's a Metalwork Brothers tool, the jig. What I'll end up doing is these are the bearing ends inserts that will go into the rear end, into the third member. I'll end up clamping these down, getting those tight, then I'll bolt this housing in place, and then out on the ends, these will position the bearings, the bearing cups, and these are a very, very tight fit. Now what goes through the center of this is behind me. Of course, once I get the shaft, I'll show it to you. The shaft by itself is in this in that tube right there, and that shaft alone is, I would dare to say by itself, it's probably about 50 pounds, so there's not going to be any flex with that. So I'll bolt this third member in place into the rear end, and then I'll slide that shaft completely through. I also have to bevel these axle tubes to mimic this bevel, which is kind of back to the old pipe welding days that I used to do a lot of. And once I get that all set up, I'll slide these bearing cups in with these locating hubs, and then I'll lock it down with these collars. Once I get that, then I'll put 4-cornered tacks on, and then I'll leave that jig apparatus in place until I'm comfortable with what I'm doing. Once I get the tacks made, I'll double check my measurements, and then I may pull this thing off and then stick it back in the car. And like I said earlier, since I've taken an axle and set it up to where I could put 2 studs in it for the GM bolt pattern, I may go ahead and bolt the axle up in there and then just hang the wheels and tires on and verify, make sure, you know, the rear end's gonna float and not hit anything before I finally weld this all out. So all right, so you can see I've got both the axle tubes beveled on each end. And I also had to open up the ID on this axle tube because it was a little bit close. It was a little tight, smaller actually than the sleeve was that's on this bearing end. I've got a little bit of a gap, which I think is good. And I was figuring on if they were completely butt weld, I was gonna put a 3/32 gap in there anyhow. And I've kind of made up for that for my cuts. But the jig's in place, everything's locked down. Also, I did put a little bit of an upward angle on the back end of these bearing cups for the brackets. So, and it was somewhere around 3 to 4 degrees up tilted up in the back with the pinion being pretty true and level. So I think I'm gonna do four-sided tacks, and then I'm gonna verify my measurements, and I think I'll weld it out if everything looks good. So. Okay, I've got the wheels mocked up. I like I said, I took both of those axles and I was able to put me a couple of lugs in just to hold the wheel in place. I'm gonna make in the center section where the axles come together, I've got them cut off already, but I'm gonna make me a collar that way I can kind of pin them together to keep any wobble out. But I have the axle, or the new axle bearings tacked into place. I've got all the 4-link bars in place. Everything's welded on the rear end as far as the brackets. And I've just used these pieces of aluminum just to set kind of a ride height. Pretty much I'm ready to kind of verify everything and make sure everything's gonna work before I weld everything. And I spent today moving stuff around in the shop. You can see a little bit of difference in here, but I've got 2 of these 4-post lifts, and both of these lifts have the wheels, caster wheels, so you can move them around. And my plan is I'm gonna move that Camaro up there and slide that lift over just a little bit more. Once I get it in position, I'm gonna bolt the front tires on this bad boy, and I'm gonna spin this thing around, and I'm gonna set this on that 4-post lift up front and work on the ride height and basically assemble the doors, get the doors hung on it, and the front clip and all the metal. And go through and do all the final prep work on the body to get it ready for paint. So actually it'll end up going to a buddy of mine's shop, and he'll be doing the final body work, but I want to get all the gaps fit. And I've got one door skin, and I made a repair on the other door last week, kind of in the same spot as the other door was. I had to cut a piece out here, put a new piece in, and so I've got this door ready to skin, and I'll end up getting the door skin and get them hung. But anyway, I thought about setting the camera up while I move this car, but I'll probably just move it and then get it set up and get it into position, and then I'll probably start filming some of the front clips. So anyway, we'll see you whenever I get back. So here it is on a Saturday evening, and I have spent the entire day pushing and moving cars and jockeying lifts. So the Camaro, the 69 Camaro, had been a permanent fixture on the 2-post lift for quite some time. And as you can see in the background, it's sitting on its own 4 feet for the first time in quite some time. This is a huge milestone right now. I just got done hanging that door. I've got quite a bit of work to do to that door. Getting the seams lined up, fitting the way I want, but it's not bad, really. I got to drop the front end, and I may raise the ass end up just a little bit, but that's a pretty sick ride height. That's kind of what we're shooting for on this car. I'll do a little quick walk around. Engine's mocked up in place. I got the brakes on it. I just threw this front fender up on it. Both of them I've got to put lower patch panels in, clean that up. They had these fenders, they had these fenders trimmed out for some big old gold rims. So I'll skin the other door, hang the other door, and this is where I'm gonna finish building out the metal. Hopefully get everything fit up, send it to the body shop. Sweet. Thanks for watching.